Before we dive into this one, two things. First, the Silvercore Club. This is honestly the simplest way to keep yourself covered. ATT, support, and liability insurance all in one membership. No piecing things together, no gaps, just clean, straightforward coverage so you can focus on the range and not on the paperwork. Secondly, today's guest, Noah Schwartz, tells me that publishers don't really have an appetite for books like his. They don't think that people out there are actually interested in reading them. If you like what Noah has to say and you want to see more work from him and others like him, I would highly, highly, highly recommend that you purchase his book. There's going to be a link in the bio. I know times are tough, things can be tight with a lot of people. If you're unable to make a purchase, leaving a review for the book or sharing it with others would mean a great deal to helping authors like Noah be able to produce more content like this in the future. Now, without further ado, let's get on with this episode. For years, Ottawa has passed sweeping firearms legislation without a single study to back it up. My guest today is the political scientist who checked the homework. He took the safety courses himself. He sat at 84 kitchen tables across the country, and in his book Targeted, wrote the first academic book about Canada's gun community told in their own words. Welcome to the Silvercore podcast, Noah Schwartz.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, it's good to have you here. I enjoyed chatting with you at the NFA event where you and I were both guest speakers there.
Yeah.
That was a fun one, eh?
It was great. It was great to be able to get together with other folks who doing work on this and share our stories and share our thoughts.
Yeah. Okay, so educate me, a fellow who just did the minimum number of university credits so he could apply when he's 20 years old to the Vancouver police. What does a political scientist do, and why would you be attracted to writing about firearms and guns, particularly in an environment that seems to be adverse to that?
Yeah, those are two great questions. So a political scientist, a type of academic that looks at the study of politics. So broadly speaking, the study of power and how power operates. Mainly, we look at sort of big political institutions, parliament, the courts, things like that. But I've always been interested in how politics happens in different ways. And advocacy and social movements are one of the really interesting areas because it's where citizens can really get involved and have their voice heard in a way that's hard to do when you live, 5,000 clicks from Ottawa where these decisions are being made. So that sort of got my interest in studying advocacy. And how I started studying firearms was completely a fluke. So I was doing my doctorate back in Ottawa, and for context and background, I grew up in a family that was very, very, against guns. I wasn't even allowed to play with Nerf guns when I was a kid. Yes.
Okay, fair enough.
And so when I, going into this, doing my PhD, I really had no idea about guns in the gun world. I was going to do my PhD on the politics of history in the relations between China and Japan. I was even taking Mandarin courses at the time.
Okay.
I very quickly realized that learning Mandarin and doing a PhD at the same time was maybe I'd bit off a bit too much, a bit more than I could chew. So I'm kind of searching around for another subject that involves those kind of two loves that I have, history and politics. And I'm messing around in the internet. There was a story in the news. I can't remember now. This was like a decade ago. But I went on the website of the American NRA and I found that they have firearms museums. Not just one, but 3. And that kind of got me interested. So I started doing research on gun politics. I said, you know what, if I'm going to study this, I need to know actually what the process looks like from the inside. So as you said, I took the PAL class and the RPAL class. I'm very proud to say I passed. I was in Ontario, so I took the Hunter's Ed program as well, and just kind of fell into this area of study. So as I said, it started off looking at the politics in the United States. I very quickly realized that there is a debate going on here in Canada that's, I think, way more interesting actually than what's happening in the U.S. What's happening in the U.S., the gun debate in the U.S. has been, the battle lines have been drawn for ages, and there's not really much movement and nothing happening. But in Canada, there's so much shifting. The typical cast of characters that you have doesn't look like it does in the stereotype of the United States. So I actually found the Canadian gun debate much more interesting, and I said, I'm going to study this now.
So you talk about the cast of characters. I'm sure you had a bit of a preconception of what that would look like prior to getting into this. how did that change as you started going through your study? And what did it look like to you to begin with? A guy who couldn't even touch Nerf guns to where you endeavor to stick your toe in the water and then jump full into the pool.
Yeah, no, it's been a wild ride. I think my first experience actually with real firearms was through an ex-girlfriend.
Okay.
So she was obviously not my ex at the time, but she was from rural Alberta, and we went back to visit her family, and they had firearms, and we went shooting on her property. And that sort of was one of the cracks that first started to appear in my old view of kind of guns and gun owners coming from completely the outside and having, those... I'm from suburban-Ottawa. I have those kind of urban preconceptions that a lot of people had about people in the gun community. And that was kind of the first crack that started to appear because I realized these are normal people. Her parents were school teachers, right? We're shooting safely in the backyard with all of the rules in place, and everybody was licensed and following the regulations. And I was like, oh, wow, this is actually an activity that people do that's fun and safe and completely normative. And as I got further into that world, I think those preconceptions broke down. The best solution to political polarization is meeting people and meeting people that you are different from you and come from different walks of life. And over the course of my research, I've had the honor of meeting hundreds of people from across Canada, from the far north to downtown Toronto, who are interested in guns and getting to know their perspective. And they look, each of those people is completely unique,
The more people that I meet that are completely different from myself, they come from different backgrounds, they have different beliefs, they have different perspectives on the world, the more I find how closely we actually are related and how much we really do have in common. Yeah. And we seem to live in a society that wants to, and I guess we've always lived in a society that wants to polarize, maybe not at the velocity that's happening right now, but the tribalism has always been in place. Being able to just sit down at the table with people who you have a preconception about, or you might even completely disagree with what you think their background or their ideas are. I think that's something that's really tough for a lot of people, particularly nowadays when you're rewarded with a short attention span, you're rewarded with the quick clips on social media and the quick comebacks, and I don't even have to listen to you because you're in this camp and I'm in that camp. Did you find that, obviously you would have to park your preconceptions going in, but that doesn't necessarily mean the people that you're talking to are going to park their preconceptions about you?
No, that's for sure. And being, I always talk about being like the, Jewish academic from the suburbs with glasses and,
Sure.
I don't look like I sat at the cool kids club, right, in high school.
Fair enough.
So it's always, going into spaces but I've always been amazed by how friendly people are, right? Like when you put yourself out there in a non-online space and you introduce yourself to people in real life, like it's really easy to be mean on X or on Blue Sky. It's really hard to be mean to someone in person to their face. And I think that really helps us get over a lot of stuff, especially in a country as geographically enormous as Canada, where how many people who grew up in Ottawa are going to go out and shoot guns in rural Alberta, right? 3 hours north of Edmonton. That, that's not an experience that everybody gets to have. And so I think, once again, that meeting face to face, talking to people, going out and shooting with folks, it's eye-opening.
So you talk about the American gun culture and you talk about Canadian gun culture, and there's a difference between the two of them. And the Americans, they're enshrined, these are our rights, this is what we have. Whereas Canada, we're looking to be treated like citizens. Essentially, I think that was coming out in your work there. Can you walk me through that distinction and why that's load-bearing?
Yeah, that was really the key point of Targeted, the book that I wrote, that I really wanted to drive and get across. As I said, my first book was on the National Rifle Association and American gun culture and politics, right? And looking at it in Canada, just the differences that I observed in the way that people think about themselves, think about firearms in their lives, and think about their community was quite stark, and how that comes out in advocacy. So I think Canadian gun owners see themselves as highly regulated people who have worked really hard. They've sacrificed elements of their personal privacy. One thing I tell people, especially my students in my gun politics class, I say, when you apply for your firearms license, if you've had a breakup, in the last 2 years, you have to tell the RCMP and give them your ex's information, or give them a phone call. Which, when I for the project I applied for my license, and I'd had a breakup recently, I had to call my ex and have that conversation. Right?
Yeah.
It's and we parted on very good terms. We were lucky, but it's still an uncomfortable conversation to have. And I think when people outside of the gun community or who aren't familiar with it hear that, they say, "Wow, this is something serious." So a lot of the folks I spoke to said, we've sacrificed these huge elements of our personal privacy, which, apparently are sometimes subject to cyber hack, right? As we've learned recently.
Yeah, and they have been hacked, and there's a lot of the information's been leaked, which has come out. Which
is really scary and, problematic when you think about it. So people have made that sacrifice, and they kind of just wanted to be treated fairly by the government, right? They've been vetted. You go through a daily background check with the Canadian Police Information System. And after that, I think people just want to say, we follow the rules. We've gone through this. We just kind of want to be left alone to do our thing, right? In a way that I think in the United States, even the idea of something like safe storage laws is a non-starter in a lot of places. Or the idea of licensing and vetting, people are very, very resistant to that. Or I think the Canadian gun community broadly accepts that, we're willing to make these sacrifices in the name of public safety, but after that, just kind of let us do our thing.
So what does being treated fairly look like? Because that'll differ. If you talk to a gun person, they're going to say, look, I've done my courses, I'm background checked, I'm daily checked, you talk to my ex, you talk to everybody around me, you got doctor's notes, whatever it might be, depending on the time when they put their application through. And now you can go back the entire person's lifetime for any history of instability or violent sort of tendencies in nature. They're going to say, I've done it. I'm good. Leave me alone. Whereas I would think that somebody who's afraid of firearms or anti-firearms or has an agenda to the contrary would have a very different perspective on what's fair. So what's fair, and how do you keep yourself objective in this when you're looking at this? Because I can personally look at it and say, I try my damnedest to be objective as to what can be fair, but I can't overcome some of my just biases, which I consider logic.
No, exactly. I mean, I think being treated fairly is I've owned and used something for my entire adult life. I've always acted responsibly. Just let me keep my stuff. That's what I heard from people. And we definitely know what being treated unfairly looks like, which I think is a lot of the legislative changes that have been made in the past decade. Things like the ban on what the government's labeled assault-style weapons, like the handgun freeze. I was, just on Our Canada Guns today on Reddit, and there was someone talking about how their father had a pistol that was his service pistol, a revolver when he was a police officer. He kept it, was able to keep it in his civilian life, and it's hugely meaningful for him. It's part of his, a big part of his career that he carried it, and he wants to pass it down to his son. And he can't do that, even though his son has the same license, has gone through the same process, is legally able to own handguns. He's not allowed to inherit that firearm because of the handgun freeze. That, to me, is unfair. So I think it's easier sometimes to see, what's unfair than what's fair. And I
agree. Yeah.
A lot of people have raised red flags with me when we spoke about how they're being treated right now by the government.
So talk about sitting at the cool kids club in school. What's this like in university? Like, you got to be a social pariah by speaking out about this kind of thing, because it puts you in a completely opposite camp to what I would think most universities and higher education's political leanings would be.
Yeah, it's tricky. I think it once again, it's one of those situations where you have to have face-to-face conversations with people. Because when I explain my research, when I lay it out, and publish it in a book, people have been broadly accepting of it, I think. And especially, maybe I'm at a bit of a special place, the University of the Fraser Valley. It's a small university. It's kind of on the cusp between, urban Vancouver and the rural Fraser Valley and in the interior of British Columbia. We get students from a variety of backgrounds. I teach a course on guns and politics. And I get students, I have them do a reflection at the beginning. They tell me their position on guns and what factors in their life they think led them to developing that position. And I'll get students who say, I don't think anyone should be able to own guns at all. And I get students who say, I think we shouldn't even need a license to own guns. So we get a broad spectrum of opinions. And that makes it easier, because I think most people, when you sit down and you explain the way the laws work, and and have a reasonable conversation, they say, oh yeah, I don't see a problem with that. Like, if someone's willing to go through that vetting process to store their firearms safely, they should be allowed to own them. I think the problem is that the debate often happens on this level of hyperbole and especially we see everything through an American lens because so many people in Canada follow American news much more closely than Canadian news, that it's hard to have those long form conversations with people and kind of talk them down from their preconceived position.
Well, what's the end goal of that course? Is it just for the students to develop epistemic discretion and be able to come up with their own decision based on something that is you can weigh and measure, or is there something else to that I might not be seeing?
Yeah, no, the goal of the course is to have students explore and learn political science concepts, looking at a really interesting issue that excites them. But for me, part of the goal of it as well is to really have them observe and examine this issue in a way that they might not have before. And what I find, so I have a reflection at the end of the class as well, right?
Interesting.
And they all go into it with really extreme opinions. And by the end, they're like, oh yeah, I can see why people would want to, even like the anti-gun students will say, oh, I could see why someone, a hunter or a sport shooter or a collector might want to own firearms and broadly they should be allowed to do that. Or students who might have been on the other end of the extreme will say, okay, I can see that, some things like licensing are actually kind of reasonable as long as they're carried out in a transparent way and they're done right. And I think I'm accepting of that. So I like that. I like that everyone kind of comes and coalesces around the middle ground by the end of the course. I think it shows that they've thought about the issue more critically.
I think you're hitting the nail on the head when you say you have to talk to somebody face to face if you want to have these more difficult discussions, because that doesn't give a person a place to run if they just want to snipe, throw jabs and run away and hope other people will do the same. But when you sit down face to face, I think Mike Tyson had a quote about that, didn't he? Like, more people would, I think people would be a lot more polite if they knew that they'd be punched in the face if they didn't,
right.
for what they say. Like,
yeah.
Something along those lines. But when you're sitting down face to face, there's accountability for your words and for your actions. And I think people consider what they're going to say perhaps a little more carefully, and they consider the person that they're dealing with, because now you're a human. You're not just some text on the screen. How would you suggest people of the, well, let's start just with the gun community, because that's my background. That's kind of what I know. People in the gun community, from my cold dead hands, you ain't getting them, right? Whatever it might be, that a position that an extreme person in the gun community might take, what would be an approach that they can take to articulating their thoughts and the points in a way if they're talking to somebody who's vehemently against firearms?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is always telling stories. Stories are a part of our DNA. They're a part of who we are. They're a part of how we evolved as beings. We're social animals. We emerge telling stories to one another. That's how we've become, the apex hunters, is because you can tell stories of how you hunted in the past, and other people can learn from that without having to, put themselves in danger and learn that trial and error. So there's an evolutionary component to the importance of storytelling, but it also, it humanizes things. Like I think people outside of the gun community fundamentally don't understand what guns are used for. I think they think of them as, there's all these kind of negative stereotypes about people overcompensating, or, I just want to own a gun to look tough. And when you talk to people, they say, no, what this gun actually means to me is I got it from my grandfather. And it reminds me of going whitetail hunting in the woods with him. Or I, got this for skeet and trap shooting. And it reminds me of spending time with my skeet and trap club and making friends there. So I think telling those stories and explaining why firearms are important to you, because that's something that might seem obvious to you, but to someone outside the gun world, it seems completely foreign. I think the other thing that would help the community, especially online, is I think toning down some of that rhetoric, because I think the community is frustrated. I feel that. That came out in so many of the conversations I had with people, where I literally had people break down crying with me over Zoom, talking about how they're going to lose their collections, these firearms that, belong to their uncle, their father, that are hugely meaningful to them. So I feel that frustration on a really visceral level. But when people express themselves online in a way that's very, aggressive or intimidating or using that from my cold dead hands rhetoric, it kind of undermines the legitimacy of the community. And it's really easy for people on the other side to use that, to take that screenshot and say, look at these crazy gun knights, waving their rifles around like this. So I think turning down the tenure, focusing on storytelling, and then also explaining the way the laws work in Canada, the process to people. There's actual research that was done by Dr. Gary Mauser and his colleagues showing that the overwhelming majority of Canadians know absolutely nothing about our gun laws. They might be vaguely aware that Canada has something called, gun control, and the United States doesn't have gun control, both of which are oversimplifications, of course. But they don't know any of the details of that. And when you tell them even that licensing story, a lot of people go, oh, wow. I didn't realize it was that hard to get a gun in Canada. I didn't realize that that's what people have to go through. You must be serious about this. This isn't kind of something frivolous. So I find that useful, just to build bridges, bring down the tenor of the debate, and really show people why these are meaningful tools to you, not just a brand of something to make you look tough, right?
Make you look tough, yes. And Gary, he's done a lot of good work. He's been on the podcast as well.
Oh, nice.
Known him since I've been just a little kid going to the gun shows, but and he's got some interesting perspectives on things too, and things that I haven't thought of before that apply to how firearms laws were created initially in Canada, and sort of the racism behind that. I guess it was an anti-Irish sentiment is something that he was talking about, and maybe not so much racism, but more elitism, because it was the new Irish immigrants that had less money, and they thought, well, if we don't want these guys having guns now too. And so, like, there's all these different little aspects to the human nature and why we create these laws and move forward with them, which I find kind of interesting. And, when we look at the last question about how do we have this conversation with somebody who's against it, and I would say I would apply the same thing for somebody who's against firearms to somebody who's pro-firearms. I tend to ask questions, and I do my damnedest to try and understand, and then I will ask them questions like you say about license. Oh, you said that anybody can own a gun and they can run around with a thing in their car and do whatever. Did you realize that we have a system in place at blah, 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 and we go through this? I think a problem that I've heard iterated by gun owners often is that gun owners try to lead with logic. Look at the numbers. Look at the percentages. Look at this, right? And an anti-gunner would lead with emotion. If it could just save one life. And, like, what if it was your child? And it's hard to have a logical debate at emotional level, or an emotional debate at a logical level. And that's, I think, where a big part of the disconnect comes. So maybe through storytelling, we can take some logic and interject emotion in a way that the other person can feel. Yeah,
there's the tricky part about that gets in the way of good political discourse sometimes, unfortunately, is human nature and the way our brains work, right?
Yes.
We're using, I heard someone say, we're using Paleolithic hardware to deal with space age problems, right? Like,
yep.
our brains haven't changed that much since we were running around as hunter-gatherers. And that makes it tricky, because when you do face someone with facts and logic, right? We know that people don't just absorb facts and logic and readjust their worldview. It's really cognitively taxing. Like, it's really mentally straining to change the way that you look at the world on things that are deeply ingrained for you. And so people's brains will do a lot of mental gymnastics to avoid doing that, right? So when you trigger, it's called defensive bias. When you trigger someone's defensive bias by presenting them with a fact that they're not familiar with, that contradicts their worldview, they get angry and upset, and it can actually often make people double down on their opinions rather than change their mind. And I find stories are sort of Trojan horses that are able to kind of sneak facts and logic into a debate in a way that people find less threatening, right? That are humanizing, that allow you to really present those facts, but not in a way that's going to immediately pose a fundamental threat to someone's worldview, and might actually get them to think about it more deeply. And yeah, this is where gun control is tricky, because the the argument for control always has really powerful stories on its side, because it just takes, you can have all of the statistics in the world that show that, in Canada, your chances of being killed in a mass shooting are 1/10 of 1 in a million. 0.11 out of a million, right? Which is like less than your chances of being struck by lightning. But one story of a really tragic, horrific mass shooting is enough to sort of override that and say, okay, no, I'm scared now. I feel threatened. So we have to do something. Even if it's something that, the evidence shows isn't going to work. I don't pay a price for that because the person isn't impacted by the laws that are passed. They don't understand that these laws are a form of political power, the execution of political power, right? And so it's very easy to support that just because you've heard this scary story. And so I think it's why it's so important, and why I really try hard in the book to tell the stories of Canada's communities of gun owners, because that's the story that we don't hear. It's a longer story to tell. It's not as exciting, right? It's not as dramatic. It doesn't meet the qualities of newsworthiness, right? If it bleeds, it leads. But it's the everyday reality of gun ownership in Canada in 99.99999% of cases.
So who's going to care enough to read this? Like if I've based my own persona and my personality on a certain viewpoint, and somebody attacking that or stating things out of fact that I feel are attacking that is going to be an existential threat to my own existence, my own reality, why would I pick up your book?
Yeah, I think because, once again, it explores the topic in a way that's not saber-rattling. It's not necessarily, the targeted doesn't deal specifically with those kind of legislative questions. It's really about it's telling the story of the community of gun owners, how they practice advocacy, how the community's formed. And I think it explains the legislation as it stands in Canada, I think, in a way that might not necessarily threaten someone's defensive bias in that way. You're just reading stories about people who are in the gun community, and at the end of it, hopefully you have a more complete and human picture of what that looks like.
How do we practice advocacy in Canada, particularly in the firearms realm? And what are we getting right and what are we getting wrong?
That's a great question. Yeah, so there's the interesting thing about the community of gun owners in Canada and the political advocacy around that is the different factions, I would say. Right, you have the older and more established groups, like the BC Wildlife Federation, like the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters, who are the conservation groups, and they came out of this unlikely marriage between sportsmen and conservationists in the late 19th century, throughout the 20th century, that led to the development of Canada's wildlife management framework, the way that we preserve species in Canada, right? The end of the 19th century, overhunting has led to huge crises across North America. We have the disappearance of the wild bison. You have the turkey population collapsing. You have white-tailed deer and other species disappearing. And this hunters and sportsmen get together with conservationists, and they create this framework for managing wildlife in Canada. And that gets into, how we legislate hunting with tags and licenses, managing wild species. I'm sure I don't have to tell this to your audience. Everyone's probably pretty familiar with it. But it leads to the resurgence of all of these species, the protection of vast wild spaces in Canada and the United States. And it gives these groups a ton of legitimacy because suddenly hunters aren't just people that are off having fun in the woods. They're integral to the way that we preserve wildlife and wild spaces in Canada. And they do something really powerful, which is harnessing self-interest to create good public policy goals, right? A lot of hunters that I've met care deeply about conservation and go above and beyond. But even if you're a hunter who doesn't care at all about conservation, you're still buying tags. You're still paying taxes on equipment that are funding conservation. Right in the United States, they have the Pittman-Robertson Act. So any firearms, ammunition, outdoor equipment, there's a tax on that goes towards funding conservation. So these harness the self-interest of people in the outdoors community to protect wildlife. I think it's one of the most beautiful, examples of public policy, and I point to it whenever I can. And the other side of the gun community in Canada is more advocating for collectors, for sport shooters. They've emerged more recently out of the political battles of the 1970s, although the groups have kind of changed over the years. We have the more recent iteration, right? The National Firearms Association, the NFA, the CCFR, the Canadian Coalition for Firearms Rights, and the CSSA. And these folks, they practice a little bit of grassroots advocacy, right? Mobilizing the community for letter writing campaigns, talking to their members of parliament, which is really useful. And then they practice a bit of sort of that lobbying in Ottawa, talking to decision makers. A lot of people, when you hear lobbying, it sounds like a bad word, right? Because
it's not, but yes.
Exactly. Lobbying, as I tell my students in my advocacy groups class, lobbying literally just means talking to politicians. If you go talk to your MP, you are lobbying. You might not be a paid lobbyist, but you're engaging in lobbying, right? Which is, something that these groups do, because policymakers, as I also tell my students, being a member of parliament is one of the few jobs in the world that you don't actually have to be qualified for. You just have to convince enough people that you are. And
right.
A lot of folks are put in cabinet positions for reasons other than their expertise on the issue, shall we say, right? Their visibility, they're a member of a certain group that the government wants to be seen associating with, things like that. And so lobbyists serve a super important function, which is educating policymakers about things that they might not know a lot about. So this is sort of what advocacy looks like in Canada. Where I think that advocacy could go next is finding a way to create another marriage, right? And I think the moment that we're seeing right now, the need that I think we see is for Canada to get a handle on its national defense in a way that we haven't worried about in the past, right? The world is a more dangerous place. We've realized with the changes down south that we can't necessarily count on the Americans for our defense in the way that we used to, right? We have threats in the Arctic from Russia, from other hostile nations. And we really have to start taking responsibility for our own defense and thinking that through. We see the government doing that sort of with regards to increasing funding for the military, which is great. It's something that we've needed to do for a long time. But what we haven't thought through and what I think we could really get back to is that civilian military connection.
Interesting.
So the first sport in Canada to receive federal funding was not ice hockey. It was rifle shooting.
That's right.
Because governments at the time understood that having a population that was responsibly and reliably trained to use firearms, and having that population be regulated, obviously, could be a useful tool for national defense, right? Changes in the way that warfare was fought changed that policy. I think government started to get away from the idea that individual marksmen mattered on the battlefield in an age of artillery and planes and tanks. But I think what we're seeing now, and in places like Russia's war in Ukraine and stuff like that, is that no, individual soldiers on the battlefield matter, and their ability, their marksmanship is important. And so I think getting back to a model, if we can create another marriage between sports shooters and national defense in Canada, I think that can move the community a long way, right?
That's interesting. I mean, there's a lot to be said for the perception of power over the reality of power. I mean, if that was the famous saying back in the day, what was it? I think it was Japan didn't want to come into the U.S. because they would have marksmen everywhere. Everyone had a gun, and it was that was the part that instilled fear in coming over, is how armed of a populace that they have. And Canada's always had a reputation for marksmen, for robustness. We got that lumberjack, cold weather, being able to hit things at a long distance. There's this idea that goes along with Canada. Whether that's a reality or not, there is that perception of it.
Yeah.
And I think, so I'm going to completely step outside my realm. I'm not a political scientist, but just somebody looking at it from the outside. Like, I look at the need for rough and tumble people to come in and help create a country, and to be able to defend the weak and those who are defenseless, and be able to stand up to foreign forces. And there's a need for that when you're creating a country. Once a country starts getting established and they think, okay, they think things are pretty good here. I mean, there's no wars going on. All of a sudden, these rough and tumble people, and we can call these people firearms owners or whatever it might be, these armed people that can portray a perception of competency and ability, well, they kind of feel a little threatening right now. Right? I mean, we're putting more and more rules in place, so people have to follow the rules, and we have this subset of society that existed because they could push those rules in a way that that most others wouldn't. Now that feels a little bit threatening to us. What do? Do we just let's get rid of them? Because that's a threat to our ability to govern if we have this subset that doesn't need us. You know, they say if you have a problem, call up the police. Well, if they don't need the police, well, why are they calling them, right? If they can grow their own food, if they can take care of their own injuries or whatever it might be, there's less of a reliance on a system that starts being put into place. And that, I think, looks like a bit of a threat to the system, which may just be why so much of our policy seems aesthetically driven. Like if I look at what's being banned and what isn't, like the famous example of the Mossberg Plinkster, a little .22 rifle, I think it was a 702, perfectly legal. But if you put a stock around this, a clamshell, and call it the 715T, holy crow, that thing's prohibited. We got to get rid of that thing because aesthetically, maybe it looks like it imbues the individual with more competence. And again, might be stepping outside my realm there a little bit, but I see that played on both sides. I see it from my position as a government looking like its citizens claiming capability that the state hasn't granted them. And I see the individual looking at it, perhaps in an aesthetic, as I haven't surrendered my capacity as a citizen. What are your thoughts on that? Did I completely step outside my realm on that one?
No, I think that's a really profound thought. I think the aesthetics thing also comes down to, once again, that identity component and how Canadians think about themselves. Because Canadian identity has always, I think, been constructed in opposition to American identity, right? We have probably more in common with Americans than we often like to think about, right?
Sure.
We share the world's largest undefended border. We consume probably 99% of what most people consume, unless you're an avid, CBC Gem watcher, is American content, right? So we have that kind of little brother syndrome, feeling, wanting to assert our identity in opposition to what it means to be American. And I think for a lot of the Canadian public, the way that Canadian identity was constructed in the 60s and 70s with the CBC, with the National Film Board, with these big government institutions that were putting out Canadian content partially to push back on Quebec separatism, but also to push back on these sort of what they saw as the encroachment of American culture in Canada. They created this image of Canada and the Canadian that is antithetical, I think, to gun ownership. It's urban, it's Eastern. As it engages with the outdoors, it does so in kind of like a Laurentian sort of way, where you're in a canoe wearing plaid, like the Prime Minister, right?
Yeah.
That's how we engage with the outdoors. We don't, we're going to ignore that entire history of hunting and trapping and exploring in Canada. We're going to ignore the legacy of Canadian soldiers who struck fear into the hearts of Germans in World War I, Canadian outdoorsmen who patrolled the Pacific coast during World War II, protecting against, a potential Japanese invasion. We're going to write these things out of history and kind of focus on this way. And I think this is where changing that story, changing how we think about ourselves as Canadians in a way that allows us to flex our muscles a bit more, I think meets the demands of the moment. Once again, that changing threat environment that we're facing. There's nations, all over the world. Germany is waking up and rearming and potentially bringing back conscription. All over Europe, Finland is building gun ranges and encouraging their citizens to train to learn rifle shooting because they remember the Winter War, the last time the Russians came across the border, and they remember that it was, folks on cross-country skis in the backcountry sniping at Russians that was able to turn the tide of that war, right? So I think we have to get back to it. We have to change the way that we think about what it means to be Canadian, to recognize that firearms have played a role in our history, right? Explorers, people trading with Indigenous folks, Indigenous peoples in Canada have used firearms to do good and bad things.
Sure.
Throughout our past.
Sure.
Right? That's a part of our national story too. And we shouldn't be afraid to protect what we have, especially in the North. There's a lot of countries that I think, especially as the climate continues to change and we see more shipping routes up north and more access to those critical minerals, there's a lot of countries that are going to want what we have. And if we're not prepared to protect the North, the map of Canada could look very different in 20, 30 years than it does now.
Well, Finland, the example you put there, I was in Finland last year, and it was a common point of conversation. Like, it's on the tip of their tongues, talking about the fact that, we have neighbors that we got to make sure that we keep ourselves prepared for.
Yeah.
Canada doesn't have that quite as recent of a memory of it, and it definitely seems to have suppressed any past memories. How do we tell those stories as we move forward? How do we tell that story in a way? Because I can tell the story and I can preach to the choir and I can talk inside an echo chamber. I mean, that's a reason why I started the Silvercore podcast, is to try and talk about issues to a wider demographic. I'll understand the fact that I'm biased. We all are. We all have our backgrounds. I try my best to be open, and I try my best to be able to introduce people into the world of that I know through ancillary ways. It's not always going to be the gun manufacturer that I'm talking with. Sometimes it's going to be the person who just likes to hike or ski or be outside, because there's a bleed over between all of this, and it's personal agency and resilience and capability while you're in a remote area, and firearms play a role, but I try my best to keep it as not the talking point, right? It's not about the gun. The gun just happens to be a piece of the puzzle that's in there. So am I doing an okay job in how we tell the story, or how should we as Canadians tell this story so that the Laurentian elite say, all right, well, it's not my story, but I get it. Right.
we have to be careful there. I come from the Laurentian elite, so I always introduce myself like that as a a central Canadian out west, right?
Sure. Yeah, I hear it.
No, I think building those institutions, right? What you've done, building this podcast and building Silvercore, what Dan Fritter has done, building Caliber magazine. Like, I think the most powerful thing that you can do to make change is build something. Right? And build something that goes beyond you and reaches a wide audience. One thing that I think if the community of gun owners got together and put the money together and built a Canadian firearms museum to preserve and tell that story, I think that would go wonders. You put it somewhere in the Quebec-Windsor corridor, so you have 80% of Canada living in that area. You have the highway that sort of connects those communities. You get a lot of visitors, right? There are firearms museums in the U.S. that get hundreds of thousands of visitors every year, and people who aren't necessarily gun people. They just sort of saw the sign on the highway and said, "Hey, I have a kid who plays Call of Duty. Maybe that'll kind of get him off his phone for for a couple of minutes." Right?
And they're cool, those museums.
Yeah,
the Springfield Armory. Have you ever checked that one out?
Oh no, I'll have to add it to my list.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole history aspect to all of it, and then there's a machining aspect, and industrialization and community aspect, and the firearms are a big part of what they're telling in there, but there's a bigger story being told.
And they open up stories and they open up histories, right? Like so much of my interest outside of academia, in looking at firearms is that connection to history. Because and one thing that's interesting reading Caliber magazine, I remember reading one about the Winchester rifle and its connection to the Pacific Coast Military Rangers here in BC, right? Because they weren't going to issue them with, Lee Enfields that they were going to send to the battlefield. These guys are hanging around in the bush, keeping an eye out for Japanese boats and submarines or planes or balloons, one of the big things, right? Those munition balloons that they'd send over. They're going to go out and they're going to have a lever action because it's handy in the woods and they can use it to hunt, but also, it gives them some capability if they end up in a violent exchange. So guns as windows to history is something that I think helps us to tell those stories. And once again, sort of highlights the significance of firearms to people who have no idea about them, have never touched one before. And you say like, no, look at this connection to history. Look at what this object tells us about Canada's past. I think having a place where we can tell those stories would be hugely impactful and hugely powerful.
I've always felt that that both sides, the anti-gunners, the pro-gunners, have made the object too much the object of their attention. They've made the gun the point that they talk about. Gun is good, gun is bad. Or as Shakespeare said, it's neither good nor bad, but thinking makes it so. The gun in the hands of someone who's willing to do ill intent, bad, right? That scares me. Not the gun, the person with the gun. That's scary.
Yeah.
But like telling the story about the gun and the history of the gun, I can see that as an important piece, but there's such a much bigger story that's being told every single day through media, through movies, and they will glorify the gun, and they make the gun, well, this person was down and out, but now they got a gun, and now they're the hero of the. They can kill the bad guys. They can do, and it's all because of this gun, right?
Right.
Especially like '80s type movies. There's Rambo. I mean, he's just one man, but he'll take down armies because look at all the guns he's got and the bandolier. I can see the importance of having the gun and trying to tell that story, but there's a big part of me that thinks that the story shouldn't even be about the gun. Like, it really shouldn't. Somebody goes in and they do damage. So what is, in the last 100 years, I will ask people this, and a listener might correct me on this one, but from my research anyways, if we look at the 4 largest by death count intentional taking of human life in the last 100 years, do we have an idea of what they are? In Canada.
I'm guessing automobiles are
no
going to be...
Well... so the intentional, so it's somebody ramming into somebody with an automobile, taking them out, that would be number 4. So right. I think that was 11 people in Toronto.
Right. Well, and more recently in Vancouver with the Lapu-Lapu
that's
festival
right.
attack.
It was how many was on that one?
I don't remember it. It was quite significant.
Yeah, it was significant. And but you don't hear about it all the time. We don't hear, let's make automobile regulations, and because the object of what's being used. Number 1, number 3 is going to be Polytechnique. That was 14 people, was it? Polytechnique that were murdered by Gavril Gabel, Marc Lepine. Portapique, number 2, and most people will call that one number 1. That was, I think, 22 people that RSL went and murdered. Number 1 was the Bluebird Cafe. You remember the Bluebird Cafe?
No,
because people never talk about the Bluebird Cafe. But some guys got themselves drunk at this cafe. I guess they're serving alcohol there too. I think there's 3 of them. They got kicked out. They got pissed. They go over to the gas station, fill up a can of petrol, throw it down the stairs. How many people there? I think it was 37 that they killed. And there was, what do they do? The government turns around and says, okay, we need fire exits. They have to be able to push to get out. We're going to have building inspections. They looked at pieces to put in and enacted some change there, but nobody goes on about, oh, look at this petrol, look at this gas massacre, which could happen, which is really easy. It's really easy everyone's got vehicles, to steal a vehicle, to use somebody else's vehicle, to rent a vehicle and cause mass damage. But that doesn't occupy people's attention. The gun does, because the gun's got a mystique behind it, which rightly or wrongly, I think people have built up through media, through movies. It's a piece of power. From a political standpoint, I think they look at it as twofold. Number 1, it's a threat to the systems that we currently have in place if somebody has the ability to defend themselves, or what if they hold us accountable and there's like an overthrow? So there's that side. And I think the other side is, wow, we can use this popularized item out there as a point of division. And if we make that our piece that we're going to push, we'll get rid of it. And the other side says, no, we want to keep it. Aha! Now the other side looks like the jerks out there that just want to see carnage. You're okay with people getting killed by guns. And I think that's all because we've made the conversation about the object.
Yeah. Well, and it's a numbers game too, right?
Okay.
If you're proposing regulations, increasing regulations on cars, right? Automobile deaths surpass firearm deaths in this country by an order of magnitude.
Yes.
But everybody drives.
Sure.
You have to. Like in Canada, it's you can't. I live in Abbotsford. I drove here to Delta, right?
Right.
It would be logistically almost impossible for me to take public transit to get here, right? This is a big country. We have wide open spaces, but there's only 2.4 million gun owners. So proposing regulation that only impacts 2.4 million people, there's a low cost for that if you're a politician, especially a politician in the center or on the left who doesn't need those. They don't think they need those people's votes, right? So there's that aspect of it as well. But I think that focus on the tool is interesting. I opened the book not talking about guns, but talking about alcohol. Because once again, alcohol is something that kills orders of magnitude more people in this country than guns. And even there's an intersection, because if you look at interviews they've done with inmates and folks like that who have been incarcerated, they found that, a significant number of them were on drugs or alcohol at the time that they committed their offense.
Yeah.
Right? Just in Abbotsford the other day, across the street from where I live, there's a grocery store, and someone was struck, and I don't know if they were killed or if they were just in critical condition. Just in critical condition, I say. Yeah. But you would never hear politicians considering further restrictions on alcohol consumption, right? Even though it kills far more people. Once again, because the uproar would be huge. People would get mad at everybody likes to relax. Not everybody, but a larger number of people likes to relax with a beer on a Friday.
Sure,
afternoon.
There's a ton of money being made by the government through the taxes on alcohol, and there's
exactly. So I think there's that component where we really have to focus on looking at the wider causes of crime and violence, and not focusing specifically on the objects. When people ask what I think we should do about the gun debate, I think it's regulate people, not guns, and that's what the Canadian system does really well, is licensing. You're automatically sifting out people who, are going to be problematic and are going to be more likely to use those guns. We know, for example, that PAL holders are less likely to commit crimes than the general public. Sure. And that makes sense. They've been subjected to background checks, right? There's the sort of informal sniff test of the firearms courses where, if you've been through a firearms course or taught one, instructors are looking for people that in that course that I have a bad feeling about that person. Maybe I'm not gonna recommend that they get their license, right? There are systems in place to keep bad actors out, right? Which I think is really the key and the core to Canada's successful system. But when we start picking guns as this gun's too scary, this gun, looks like a nice wooden grandpa's hunting rifle, fine, that's okay. We get into treacherous territory, I think, really quickly.
So 2.4% of 2.4 million Canadians, so that'd be about 6% of Canada, are firearms owners. So that makes a small demographic that are typically going to be rural voters and not playing towards what some politicians would really deem as statistically significant if they were to step on them a little bit in order to win votes in another place. However, I'm wondering if there's a way for what's happening to the 6% to be told in a story where a larger percentile will say, well, hold on a second. If they can, in 2020, say, by decree through order in council, take privately owned property, what does that mean for me going forward? You gave the example of vehicles. Everyone needs a vehicle, or places were vast. Well, there's all this talk that we keep hearing about 15-minute cities or 5-minute cities or whatever they are, and you'll own nothing and you'll love it, or whatever the current trend that they're talking about. But there is a push for, if you're to take the idea to the furthest degree, I mean, we're going to have we already have driverless vehicles. Governments can say our money should be better served for public transit, and we'll supply everything you need. You don't need a vehicle. At some point, and if you're in a rural area, maybe you can get a special license to operate this vehicle and only certain types of vehicle in certain areas, because think of the environment and the pollution it puts out. There's all this spin that can be put on it. Is there a way that the 6% can make their plight relatable to the larger percentile?
Yeah, I think part of that, goes back to that storytelling element and then building those coalitions. Right? In politics, you win by building coalitions, by making friends, right? By building alliances with other groups. So I think that advocacy and that trying to find a way to connect sport shooting to national defense, I think is huge. Because I think if we get official recognition for sport shooting, if we build those alliances with the military, suddenly you go from, being annoying to the government to being an important part of Canada's national defense picture that the government is going to be hesitant to step on. I think the other thing is building a broader coalition with people who we haven't in the past. There's a concept in the study of politics called interest group capture. And that's when an interest group gets, captured by a political party. So that interest group can't plausibly defect to another political party. This has been kind of one of the things that the American pro-gun movement has been really good at, is because a lot of gun policy happens at the state level in the U.S. There are states where the gun movement has built a coalition and built alliances with Democrats in a way that protects them from regulation. So I think the Canadian, as long as the Conservative Party remains the only safe party for Canadian gun owners, we are the community is guaranteed to lose 70% of the time.
Right.
Because the Liberal Party is the most, electorally speaking, the Liberal Party is the most successful party of any democracy in terms of like the actual clock of how long they've been in power.
Sure.
Right? They're very ideologically flexible, which allows them to change positions quickly to meet the demands of the moment and stay in power. And they've built that sort of big coalition in the center where they can now kind of steal MPs from the Conservatives, steal MPs from the New Democrats, right? So I think the community needs to, during my research, one thing that I found was that there are a lot of progressive gun owners who feel politically homeless. They feel like when they go to the gun range, all of the conversation is maybe somewhat alienating to them or a part of their identity, right? And they feel like when they're in their progressive circles, they get called. There was one guy who said his cousin found out that he had guns and he called him a Trump supporter or something like that.
Right.
So there's all these stereotypes and ideas. So I think building that coalition, giving those people a home within the mainstream of gun advocacy, and then broadening the appeal to parties like the NDP, which traditionally had a rural and working class base.
Traditionally,
right? And I've met people in the NDP who are sort of trying and working very hard to push for that within the party, but they feel kind of like lone voices in the wilderness. So I think building that broader coalition, finding a way to build institutions and then build partnerships with big Canadian institutions like National Defence, these are all kind of broader systemic level strategies that can help overcome the numerical weakness that gun owners in Canada have.
I don't disagree with your concept on alignment with national defense. I think that's a very astute point. Where I'm a little cloudy is how do you do that? Particularly in have you given thought to the mechanism for implementation on something like that? Like we look at service rifle being wiped out and the a lot of the BCRA and DCRA disciplines coming under attack. Like that was the obvious point, I think, in the past for civilian and national defense sort of overlap.
Yeah.
Have you given thought to how gun owners out there can properly advocate, or what would need to happen in order for that to even be entertained? The idea of firearms ownership and national defense, because I think it goes contrary to the aspirations of somebody who would be against firearms.
Yeah.
The fact that we have capable people out there who know how to use, spitballing, I would say mandatory conscription might not be a bad idea.
Right.
Because I look at countries that have mandatory conscription, and I know it's not a popular standpoint, but you talk to anybody who's been through it, not the people who are waiting to go through it. Nobody wants to do it. Then they go through it, and they're like, holy crow, I got to stand shoulder to shoulder with different people from different religions and different backgrounds, and I have this sense of civil pride now, and we all have eaten the same dirt, and we have a shared understanding. There's a cultural significance to being able to have mandatory conscription. I can see that as being a very beneficial piece to marrying in the idea of firearms and national defense at a national level, but I also see that one being unpopular with a lot too.
Yeah, I think that marriage has to come from advocacy.
Okay.
Right? It comes from, at the grassroots level, talking to your member of parliament, writing letters to the newspaper, things like that, right? The advocacy component. And then at the organizational level, it comes from people in organizations, like IPSC, like other disciplines that might be relevant, reaching out and doing that kind of lobbying component to see where can we build those partnerships. Can we have a military day at our range where active members of the force can come and shoot for free and have different types of competitions with civilians, things like that. So I think it comes with, it's going to have to sort of happen at the group level. I don't think the government at this point is going to reach out and make that case, but I think that there are probably civil servants within the government even if the political level doesn't see eye to eye, making those connections with powerful civil servants who are able to, facilitate events like that.
Yeah, and there might be a political appetite for it now too, based on the recent things I've read about Carney saying, "Oh, we're going to turn our civil servants into active military members, or a certain percentage of, or we're going to create an immigration system where we can immigrate soldiers from other countries." I can't see that going wrong at all. But that component, I think, would fly a heck of a lot further than the past two things that I've read about in the media that have been floated.
Yeah, and I think this is the moment. Like, that speaks to the fact that this is really the moment. Canadians are thinking about national defense in a way, and identity and patriotism in a way that they haven't, for context, within my lifetime, right?
Right.
Like, growing up when I was a kid, like, Canadian soldier equaled peacekeeper.
Right.
That was our image of ourself. And now we're starting to talk about, like, well, no, the Canadian military during World War I and World War II was, am I allowed to swear on the
You
podcast?
can swear all you
right.
want.
It was a kick-ass fighting force, right?
Yes.
That handed our enemies their butts on a silver plate, right?
Yeah, they were savages.
Yeah, so I think, Canadians have that within us. I think Canadians are a friendly and polite people, but you don't want to confuse friendliness and politeness for meekness, because I think when Canadians are threatened, they have each other's backs and they stand up. And telling that story and getting back to that strength, I think, gives us a better negotiating platform on a global stage, and helps us, and a better negotiating platform with the United States. Because right now we might hate when Trump taunts us and the folks working in his cabinet, but when our defense umbrella is based around our integration with the Americans and relying on the Americans, like, there's not a lot we can say back.
Yeah.
So
kind of asked for it.
Yeah.
Right.
So I think patriotism is cool again, and I think that's a good thing.
I do too.
And I think that we need to use this moment to once again retell Canada's story and assert the place of a responsible and well-regulated, not in the Second Amendment sense. I know well-regulated might have a bad connotation, but seriously, like a very regulated community of people who follows the rules, who are willing to jump through those hoops, and who can be an asset and help the community and their government when the time comes.
Who are already criminally record checked, vetted, trained, all the rest.
Exactly.
Interesting. I'd like to hear what the audience thinks about that, because throw it in the comments. Your thoughts. I'd like to see what people think about that one, because I like it. I think it's got legs. So here's one I wanted to pick your brain from a political science perspective. So the 2020 OIC was enacted by cabinet decree. No parliament debate. From a political theory standpoint, what does it mean that a liberal democracy has built mechanisms by which the executive can criminalize entire categories of citizen behavior without legislative scrutiny? Yeah,
I think it's part of a dangerous trend in politics that actually goes beyond Canada to the United States. And this is where, this is something that whether you're a conservative or progressive, you should be really concerned about. Because what we're seeing in the United States is a broad overreach of executive power, and executive power being stretched. And this has happened over decades, right? People have been writing about it. The unitary presidency theory in political science, where you're seeing the executive take more and more power onto themselves and kind of bypass that legislative scrutiny. And in Canada, I think we've been seeing it happen too. And I think this OIC is part of that. We've seen more and more power concentrated in the Prime Minister's office, less and less power with individual MPs. You're seeing sort of more and more MPs stick to the party line versus do their job, which is represent their constituents, right? What was the big line during the recent defections to the Liberal Party? Was that you vote for a person, you don't vote for a party in Canada, right? That's the reality of how our parliamentary democracy works. Well, if you're voting for a person, that person should represent their constituents, and they should have be empowered to do so. So I think enacting this stuff through OIC, was it legal and legitimate within the rules of the game? Yes. Does it have negative implications for democracy and the ability to have this stuff out in the open with debate? Definitely. And is it bad just from a process perspective? Even if you don't care about guns, if you care about good public policy, it's really clear that this ban is not good public policy. I think everybody's waking up to that now, even people who, once again, don't care about guns. And if this had been done properly through the legislative process, right, that's where we catch bad ideas. That's the point of having parliament is to have ideas flooded through this sort of as wide a net as possible, have multiple perspectives shared, and have policy be improved through the process. That didn't happen here. The government missed a ton of opportunities, even like with the handgun freeze. Right, a lot of Canadians are freeze. Yes, well, a lot of
we can't ban them. We'll just call it a freeze. Right.
A lot of Canadians don't realize that single-shot flintlock black powder pistols were banned alongside Glocks. Right, and when you tell people that, their eyes kind of, if you explain to them what it is, they're like, "Really? That's something that should be too dangerous for people to own." And it's because the government didn't consult with this. They didn't consult with the advocacy groups. They didn't consult with the sport shooters groups. They just put in this blanket ban that really makes so little sense considering how strictly regulated handguns were in Canada beforehand and the hoops that people had to jump through to get them. So once again, I think this is just bad public policy, and it speaks to why we need to think really carefully about how much power we are allowing to be concentrated in the Prime Minister's office versus Parliament.
So in your research and talking with all the different sides and your exposure within the university environment, why do you think they brought in the handgun ban and the OIC prohibitions? Because I'm not entirely certain it's got anything to do with guns.
I think it's about politics.
Okay.
I think it's about they looked at the numbers. It's partially, politicking over what's happening in the United States, right? Because the U.S. has a gun violence problem. Most people in Canada follow American news quite closely, right? And so politicians decided they could score a lot of points by pretending we're the United States and that they're bringing in strict gun laws that are going to save this. And you see this in the rhetoric that was used, right? Prime Minister Trudeau, when he's announcing the ban, he says thoughts and prayers aren't going to be a part of it. It's like, that's not a Canadian talking point. Nobody here says that because, we changed our laws. We've had 2 rounds of massive sweeps. This is the 3rd round, right? We had the round in the 70s, we have the round in the 90s, and now a 3rd round, right? This isn't the United States. We don't have a political inaction problem on this, right? When was the handgun freeze brought in? After the Uvalde, Texas massacre, right? Last time I checked, Texas wasn't a province of Canada.
That's right.
So this is all about scoring political points off of, once again, playing to that idea that Canadians want to feel smug about not being American. So you play to that Canadian self-image of look how much better we are to the Americans. Yeah, you're going to tick off these 2.4 million people, but they were never going to vote for you anyways because they live in rural areas or places that aren't necessarily the big urban bastions of the Liberal Party. And from that perspective, from that realpolitik Game of Thrones perspective,
sure,
politically, it sort of makes sense, except that once you bring in these policies, you have to own them. And just like the long gun registry, right? When the public starts seeing the price tag, suddenly it makes less sense to them. When you have 6 years for, idiots like me to stand up in the media and say, hey, hello, I don't think this is a good idea. That you start to break through and people start to hear that other perspective and they start to think about it carefully, right? And you see public opinion turn, which once again speaks to why we should put things through the legislative process normally.
I agree.
Right? And why we shouldn't, why public policy should be based on sound evidence and not, a desire to score political points. Obviously, that's a perfect world. That's not the world we live in. We live in a world of politics and that's how decisions are made. But, we can dream.
Okay, well, in your book, you talk about the Czech Republic, and you talk about there was a shooting that happened over there, and then afterwards, as a response to the shooting, they took action, but they did it in a different way. Why? What did they do? What happened over there? And why do you think they took a different approach than Canada?
Yeah, so the Czech Republic, their firearms laws are really interesting because I think Canadians have a tendency to imagine Europe having stricter gun control than Canada. But I think that's because we're so historically tied to Great Britain, right? And we imagine that everything that the British are doing is happening on the continent. And we know the British, like Britain and Australia have quite draconian firearm laws, right? On the continent, things are different. You see a wider variety, right? You have places like Norway and Finland and Sweden where suppressors are widely available for people to use. The Czech Republic is an interesting example because they have civilian concealed carry.
Right.
And they've brought into their constitution a sort of quasi right to own firearms. And studies that have come out, so there was a really interesting study that compared, violent levels of firearms violence in the UK and in the Czechia or the Czech Republic, and they found that Czechia was much safer, right? Which points to firearms regulation. Obviously, firearms are dangerous tools; they have to be regulated in some capacity, but that's not what's going to stop crime. Like that's a baseline, but there are tons of other factors that contribute to crime and violence. And so if we keep thinking that, every time there's a violent incident, we just have to kind of ratchet the gun control thing tighter, where we're chasing really, really diminishing returns, and we're not paying attention to the root of the problem. Which is complicated, right? There are components of psychology, there are components of sociology, right? I think a lot of, ultimately, crime stems from unmet need, right? A person who is able to get what they want through mainstream institutions in society, right, isn't going to resort to crime, right? If you're able to get a good job or, go to school and then get a good job after, things like that, right, you don't feel the need to do things like that. But when I was doing research for a recent project, I spoke to people working with communities where poverty is concentrated. I spoke to a worker in, downtown Winnipeg who they would take people who were involved in the gang lifestyle, and they'd offer them legitimate employment. And oftentimes those folks would say to them, man, this work is really hard. I can make 2 months salary in an afternoon on the street selling drugs. So why am I doing this, right? So I think addressing those really complex social problems, having those conversations, about supports for mental health, because we don't have good supports for mental health in this country.
We don't.
It's really expensive to have access to mental health services. Having those conversations about programs that help these at-risk communities and help get people out of the gang lifestyle, that's where we see the bang for our buck. And that also helps to cut through that partisan divide, right? Because a lot of the organizations that work in this space are private nonprofits. So if you're speaking to conservatives or conservative politicians, you say, this isn't a big government program. These are small, right? This is just funding to these private groups that are doing really good work.
Right.
If you're talking to progressives, you say we're tackling poverty, we're tackling systemic injustice, we're dealing with those root causes of violence. So it's a win-win. It's a program that can be sold to both sides, but it's not as politically sexy as saying, look at this scary rifle, we're going to ban it. And so it doesn't satisfy, unfortunately, that political itch that it needs to.
Because mental health is a huge aspect of this.
Yeah.
It's mentally healthy people don't go around shooting other people.
Yeah.
By and large, right? It's
well, and sorry to cut you off, but the suicide component as well, right?
Oh,
The majority of firearms deaths in Canada, or the majority of firearms deaths in Canada, are death by suicide.
81% or so.
Yeah. So this is a mental health, and it's politically sketchy to say that sometimes, because I think people feel like you're passing the buck or stigmatizing people with mental health issues. We know people with mental health issues are much more likely to harm themselves than anyone else. So we don't want to risk contributing to that stigma, but it doesn't mean we can't have that conversation about having better supports for people who need it.
It's kind of funny because when they brought in the new Canadian Firearms Safety Course program back in 1994, and prior to that they didn't have this training program, one of the first things they want people to know is the breakdown of deaths in Canada by firearm through homicide, suicide, and accident. And it's a test question that they'll ask people about. And they should know that 81% of firearms deaths in Canada are suicide. Yet they spend all of this money putting in this training program for people with firearms and with the knowledge, and got to know that suicide is going to be the biggest killer if there's a firearm death. 81% of them are going to be suicide in Canada. But why aren't we seeing the same amount of attention and resources being attributed to mental health as we are firearms? Or are we seeing it and I'm just not seeing it?
Well, and not only that, but recent legislative changes have made it more difficult, I think, for gun owners to to have access to those
Right.
right. So what's something that happens in the community when someone knows that they're going through a tough time? Often they'll pass their firearms over to someone else, right? They'll have a friend. You say, listen, I'm not doing so well. Can you hang on to my guns until I'm doing better? If you're an RPAL holder right now, how do you do that? How do you legally transfer your handguns, right? Then you're dealing with a whole bunch of bureaucracy if you're even able to do that. If you're in Quebec and they have the registry, you've added another layer of complexity to doing that. Right? Even with the regulation of private sales now, if you're doing a temporary transfer and having your buddy hold onto your guns, right? Suddenly the CFO's office is getting involved in this conversation potentially. So you're adding barriers for people to be able to, these informal institutions for people to be able to do what they need. And then plus you have the component of, one thing I heard from folks about the red and yellow flag laws is that there are people who are scared to seek out
That's
help.
it. And that's the one I think that people don't talk about as much.
100%.
The other ones, you can see them on the surface. You can see, okay, there's barriers here to them being able to go out. I have people come by here. We're a licensed firearms company. They'll bring firearms. They're going through a divorce. Can you store the firearms here? We're having a hard time. Can I store firearms here? Yeah, absolutely. Not a problem. Is there anything else we can do to help you? Right? Here's some people you can talk to. Here's some literature you can read. Well, whatever we can do to help. No, I'm good. I just, I'm taking precautions. Fair enough. You talk to people who firearms make up a larger part of their life, whether that be because it's their profession, like I own a firearms business, or they're a competitive shooter, or they're a collector. It plays a larger portion. Maybe some of their identity's tied up in that. They go and they want to talk to a talk doc. Who are they talking to? Does that person have personal biases? Yep. One phone call, one note in the binder, or on the notepad there, and they might never see their guns again in the future. And that's a legitimate concern for people.
Yeah.
I could lose my business if I'm going through a tough time. I know personally, like there's an apology letter on the wall up there from the RCMP, but they raided here, and that was a 6-year ordeal that eventually they ended up paying out an undisclosed sum and an apology letter, rare one. But you think it wasn't tough? You think it wasn't tough when you're selling your furniture in order to be able to make payroll, when you're eating freezer burnt meat from friends from years past because you didn't have enough money for food? Who am I going to talk to? I'm not talking to anyone. I don't want to jeopardize my ability to run a business. So that's, I think, a very real one right there.
100%. This is what happens when you treat this like a criminal justice and regulatory conversation, right? Every other community in Canada seems entitled, like we've started to shift our way from this sort of punitive view to harm reduction, right? When we think about the way that we're dealing with the toxic drug crisis, when you think about the way we're dealing with other social issues. But with gun owners, it seems to always be punitive. Why aren't we talking about harm reduction when it comes to firearms owners? And why aren't we to me, it just seems so obvious that we would want to create a regulatory environment that would allow people experiencing mental health issues, first and foremost, to get help without that fear of losing their, in many cases, social circle. Right. Which is a lot of people, there are folks I talk to. This woman was talking about her dad, and she said, if her dad loses his firearms, that's his social group.
Right.
We talk about, senior citizens and loneliness.
Right.
Right. So I don't know that part just I can't see it as anything but vindictive, because from a policy perspective, like it makes no sense to me. I don't, and it makes me really frustrated when I see what people like you have gone through, and yeah, that like my heart really breaks for folks in that situation.
So I'm going to switch gears here a little bit. There's a fellow by the name of Blake Brown. I guess he's my wife's second cousin. Oh. So at some point in the back, I got a book sent over to me. He says, you should read this book. It's from a relative. I don't think I've ever met him. I never read the book. I looked through it. There's got a chapter in there called Angry White Man, and I did a quick thumb through on this thing, and I'm like, I don't know. Do I want to read this book? And other people in the gun community, I kind of have to go, hush, hush, that there's some relation to this fellow, which by and large, it looks like it was supposed to be a historical account of firearms in Canada, but it also seems heavily flavored if I talk to others. Should I read this book by Blake Brown? And where do you think his lens misses what's actually happening?
I would say absolutely yes, read it.
Okay.
It is one of the books that I actually cite the most. And I think up until the coverage of maybe more modern debates, it's an incredibly fair telling of the history of guns in Canada, because it really talks about this relationship between guns and political power. Not always explicitly, but often implicitly when we talk about the sort of those, after the Battle of Quebec, for example, when Great Britain takes possession of New France's colonies in Canada, right? One of the first things that the government does is they disarm French Canadians, right? They disarm the Quebecois. With Indigenous people, right? You have the Northwest Resistance. You have Louis Riel. What's one of the things that the government does? They disarm Indigenous people and disarm Métis people, right? So I think that's such an important component of our history that we ought not forget, because often gun control policy is seen through the prism of this just kind of benevolent public safety policy. And if you're a scholar and a good scholar, you should know, first of all, there's no such thing as benevolent public safety, right? Like policy is always about picking winners and losers.
Sure.
We present policies as solutions to problems. They're more often than not trade-offs. And anything that the government does involves the exercise of power, right? Paying your taxes, right? Who's going to pay your taxes if it's voluntary? No, there has to be some component of force backing that up. No community in history has survived based on voluntary taxation. It's part of solving those collective action problems. But it means that the exercise of policy is the exercise of power, and we have to be responsible and careful and thoughtful when we do that. So I think that's what Brown's book does incredibly well, is it tells that story. I think when it gets to the, I really that name of that chapter sticks out to me too.
I know.
Because up until there, I'm like, I'm with you. I love this book, and as I said, I cite it very often. But I think there's that's where sort of maybe the political perspective can sometimes cloud that, because I think that's an unfortunate way to characterize any large group of people. It speaks to the political moment that we're in, right? Like white men are seen as a group that we can pick on politically, and you're not going to face a social cost for that, especially in progressive or academic circles. But I'm of the mind that I don't think we should stereotype anyone, regardless of whether they're from a more powerful or less powerful group. And from my empirical observations, talking to hundreds of gun owners across the country, whether that fit in the 70s and 80s, the period that he's writing about, I can't say. I wasn't alive then.
Fair enough.
But what I can say now is that doesn't characterize the gun community now, and the people that I've spoken to. Like, I talk to people from Indigenous backgrounds, people from women who are as passionate about holding on to their guns as the men in the community. So I wouldn't say that's a fair characterization anyway at the present.
Yeah, it just makes it really easy to slot people into a group. And like you say, it's politically expedient to say, well, okay, well, you're obviously on the other side now. Yeah.
And if you think about historically, if we were writing about the suffragette woman, right, it might be empirically valid to say that, the suffragettes were angry white women, right? But they had good reason to be angry, right?
Sure.
They were being mistreated by the government. They were considered not even citizens, let alone second-class citizens. So, I think that I wouldn't agree with that characterization, but I think broadly speaking, the book is something that firearms owners would appreciate, because it really does give that deep dive into the history of Canada. And because of that fact about rifle shooting being the first sport in Canada to get federal funding, that comes from that book, right? So I wouldn't know a lot of what I know now if I hadn't read it.
In your NFA keynote, you told a room full of gun owners that treating the media as the enemy is a losing strategy. It's not a popular thing to say. Why'd you say it, and what does engagement actually look like when so many feel they've been burned?
Yeah. So I think engagement means having good faith conversations with people in the media. I think there is, it's observable. We can see that there is slant in the coverage of gun owners in the media. And that, I think, by the community is often interpreted as kind of like a personal attack or some sort of vindictiveness or hatred on the part of the media. And I don't think broadly that's true. I think there are obviously some people in the media who are very political and see gun owners as the enemy. I don't think that's the majority. People, I've spoken to a lot of reporters and for the most part, I think they really just don't know much about the gun world. right?
I agree.
The majority of them are coming from big cities. Like a lot of them are based in Toronto and stuff like that. They might have never met a gun owner or have one in their social circle. They might have never been shooting. And from their perspective, it's really hard to get the perspective of gun owners because it's not like there's I'm an academic. My picture's on a website. They can call me and ask me about it, right? You can't cold call people's houses and say, hey, are you a gun owner? Right? Actually getting access to people in the community is tricky. So you'll see when they do interviews, it's often with business owners because business owners have a website.
Right.
Right? And this is where I think the part of that storytelling and outreach angle, I think if more gun ranges in Canada had someone on their board who was in charge of media relations and public relations for the range and was able to have their, reach out and say, hey, if you need to get the perspective of gun owners on a story, reach out to me. I'll connect you with someone in our club who's willing to talk. I think that would go a long way. Because I've even had reporters ask me, like, hey, do you know anyone who's affected by the ban who I can talk to? And I'm like, from an ethical perspective, I can't just cold call my past research participants and say, hey, you want to talk to a reporter, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of people aren't willing to because they're afraid it puts a target on their back, right?
Yeah.
So that's where having like someone who speaks for the club and the collective voice of the club and can maybe has a bit of media training, right, as well, so that they're putting their best foot forward and representing the community fairly and in a good light, I think would go a long way. But I think the strategy that we've seen more broadly of antagonizing the media to try to build like a political points, I think is ultimately counterproductive. I understand why a lot of people who are in politics do it. It's a good strategy for fundraising,
Right.
but it's not a good strategy for building bridges and for educating the public and having a richer, better debate that's not based on emotion.
Yeah, I think that's something that people who belong to gun organizations should be aware of and hold the directors and the organization accountable for. Are you doing something that's moving the needle in a positive way forward for what we all believe to be the shared cause, whatever that organization is? Or are you just speaking to the masses? Are you speaking to your base?
Yeah.
Are you trying to just sell memberships? Are you putting billboards up in cities that are already... you're singing to the choir, right? They're on the same song sheet. And often I see a lot of that. Gotcha. We got our gotcha points. We're going to sit down with this member of parliament and we're going to make them look really bad and we're going to raise some money.
Yeah.
Well, try getting an interview with another member of parliament after that one. Try having your voice heard somewhere. So I think there is a responsibility on anybody who's a part of an organization to look long and hard as to what they're doing. There's so many people are looking for a savior. Like, I feel hard done by. I feel put upon. I feel like there's all these rules being created and I'm losing my property and I got a lot of money in these things. Who's going to save me? And I think the reality is you're going to save you. Each individual has a high level of personal agency if they exercise it. And by putting that power into a third party, into a group or an organization, unvetted, uncontrolled, you're falling into the same traps as other people.
100%. I was listening to your episode that you did with Dan Fritter where you talk about a similar topic, and I completely agree. Once again, there are things that every person listening to this podcast can do. And I imagine that most listeners are members of a gun range. You can show up to the annual general meeting of your range or the monthly board meeting, and you can say, hey, how come we don't have a media relations person? I'm reasonably articulate. I'm a thoughtful person. I'd be happy to volunteer to do that position, right? And it probably wouldn't be a very labor-intensive position to begin with. If you've got some social media skills, if you can build a website, something like that. I think there are ways for everybody. The basic cornerstone of a pluralist democracy is the idea that everybody needs to play a role in the way that we're governed. And when you give over the responsibility to someone else to be your voice, you might not always like what they say. So, yeah, I think it's incumbent upon everybody to take action to make the political change that you want to see in the world in a way that's positive and constructive.
I'm looking at the laws here. So we look at the RCMP. They classify a firearm as non-restricted in 2017 and then prohibit an AR-15 as a prohibited AR-15 variant in 2020. So 2017, non-restricted, 2020, now it's a prohibited AR-15 variant without any new technical information. What does political science tell us about why that bureaucratic reversal happens with no consequence?
I think I think we need a lot more transparency on the way that these decisions are being made. I'll give you some perspective. I'm working on a research project right now that's not on firearms, but it's about Canada's weapons laws more broadly. Because I've spent a lot of time with the criminal code in my research, and I found like there are some sort of strange things in there. It's like why are nunchucks illegal in Canada?
I know.
Why are throwing stars? And I asked that question. I'm like, I actually want to find out.
Yeah.
So I filed a whole bunch of ATIPs, and I'm trying to get and looked at the parliamentary debate, the Hansard, and I'm sort of trying to get a sense of how those decisions are being made. And it's very, very difficult to do that about even historically, about decisions that were made in the 1970s that aren't even remotely politically contentious right now. So I think this is maybe one area where we should think about demanding more transparency from government, because where I think, if the government is serious about reconsidering the classification system in Canada and wants to do that in a good faith way that actually makes us safer, that we should really think about having like objective criteria that people can point to when we're making these classification decisions. Because it's one of those areas where I think if the general public like got into the weeds and looked at this stuff, they would say, this seems very, very complicated for needlessly so.
Yeah, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head there with having objective criteria. Like when we look at the OIC prohibitions and what's happening here, like if you're going to create laws with harsh criminal consequence, that discretionary power cannot remain unfettered. It has to have a list of checks and balances as to why you did that. And to my understanding, I don't see that. I don't see that in there.
It has to be easily understood by the public. Like how many people now are running around with firearms they have no idea are banned?
Sure.
Because instead of saying like, okay, we're going to regulate semi-automatic firearms in this way, they said these are, military style, assault style weapons, and what counts as one is it means it's on this massive list, right? So yeah, I think even if you're supportive even if you're someone who's very supportive of strict gun regulation, you could see that the way that this has been done makes no sense.
Yeah. It's funny how many people over the years I've run into, educated people, lawyers, judges, mayors, MLAs, MPs, like people that should have a good understanding of what's kind of going on, saying, oh, I got a couple of guns. I just keep them under the bed. They're not hurting anybody. And maybe I should take this course and get my license. And like they look at it exactly for what it is. I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm not a bad person. It's an inanimate object and it's sitting there without even realizing the level of criminality that they're just talking about. And they're in a position of authority and knowledge and all the rest where you'd think they'd know. And people in the gun community will come flocking in like, you can't do that. That's wrong. There's rules that you got to have in place. Yeah. But when it's becomes so complicated to understand, it becomes illusory essentially when it comes to enforcement.
Yeah. From a policy perspective, it should be as easy as possible for a person with good intentions to follow the law. It should be clear and easy. And the way that the laws are written in Canada, it's really not. Even if we think about safe storage laws, the way that the laws are written leaves a lot of ambiguity. And you see, if you look at firearms forums on the internet, is this safe storage? Am I storing this safely? Am I following the rules, right? Yeah. Whereas, like, if we just had clear criteria, if it had just been written in a way that was clear and easy to follow, the public would be safer.
Yep.
And firearms owners would be happy. I think conceptualizing the gun debate as this zero-sum equation where we need to hurt gun owners to make us safer, it's not correct. We can do both, right? We can make life easier and better for gun owners and make us safer at the same time. But if we continue to view this through this polarized political lens, we lose out on those opportunities.
You do. Yeah, I put together an affidavit, a few hundred-page affidavit for the 2020 OIC, and then I was crossed on that one. And a lot of what I said was held and actually referenced by the judge in the proceedings. I think not because I'm such a smart guy, but it's just common sense stuff, and there's nothing said to oppose what I had to say in there. But you look at the you look at the information, like the reference I gave earlier about the 22 that's non-restricted, or you put a shell around it, it's completely prohibited. They look at bore sizes over 20 millimeters and over 10,000 joules. And so you rely on SAMI specifications, which is kind of the industry standard. If you look at the government, what they put out, they just went and prohibited 12 gauge and 10 gauge shotguns. So they quickly make an amendment on the website, which has nothing to do with anything in law, but it seems haphazardly kind of thrown together. You talk about weapons. Okay, so brass knuckles, they're named as a prohibited device.
Yeah.
But a carabiner isn't. And in fact, if you take scissors and you turn them backwards, it isn't. Or if you get an Eskimo ulu, which is a big blade on the front, that's perfectly legal. Right?
Or polymer. Like there are companies in Canada that sell polymer brass knuckles, right? Which can do a considerable amount of harm to someone, but they're because they're made out of a different material. It's the same object, and
yeah. I think does it say it has to be metal, or does this have to be like at some point intent has to play a role in this? And I don't care what you pick up, if the intent is to do harm and you show that intent or verbalize that intent or whatever it is, that's where I would think the crime should start coming in.
Yeah.
Nunchucks. Okay, so yeah.
Oh, sorry, go.
I mean, what happens if you hit somebody with a stick? And, okay, that's okay. But all of a sudden, if you tie them together with a string in the middle, that's not okay? Or if they break halfway through and they're just kind of dangling it around like nunchucks, is that now prohibited?
Blowguns.
Yeah.
I saw on YouTube this, Nerfer showing people how to make a Nerf blowgun, and somebody pointed out that would be a prohibited weapon in Canada.
Well, I think
you're allowed to have a tube and you're allowed to have a dart, but the second they're found next to each other, right? And this we can laugh, but this ambiguity, first of all, can be used by law enforcement to maybe. There's someone that they don't like and they find that they can do what's called charge stacking, right? Where they use multiple charges to try to scare someone into settling and which I think you talked about being familiar with.
Well, I mean, I've consulted for Crown and Defense Counsel at all levels of court and on weapons-related use of force and firearms-related matters. It doesn't mean I'm an expert. You're an expert on that one small area, if qualified, if the judge says, yeah, okay, I accept you as an expert. And then they'll say, okay, what weight do we ascribe to your expert status? Because maybe you're an expert, but they're like, yeah, you're a small expert or a big expert, right? But the charge stacking is an interesting one. How quickly firearms charges disappear. You'll have a whole bunch of firearms charges thrown on an offense, and those are the first ones to disappear because those are the hardest ones, I think, for Crown to actually hold true, to actually push on through, because there's so much gray area and ambiguity.
Yeah, and there's a case I read from the 80s when I was doing this research of a young person walking down the street in Calgary in the 80s, and they had a spiked wristband. And spiked wristbands are prohibited weapons, according to the criminal code, thanks to these changes that were made in the 1970s, also by order in council. And so, this young person now has a criminal record of possessing a prohibited weapon. He bought it in a shop in downtown Calgary. He thought he was being in compliance with the law, and found out that he wasn't through no fault of his own. So things like this, they seem sort of innocent to the public, and I think the public would say, well, why would anyone need nunchucks, right? That would be the line. But when you stack these up and you start having all of these laws in the books, right, they're going to affect people in ways that we can't always predict. So it's important to think carefully about these things.
If a political science PhD student walked into your office tomorrow and they said they wanted to work on Canadian firearms policy, what would you tell them to read first? And what's the question you wish someone would tackle that you haven't gotten to yet?
It's a great question. I'd send them to read, I think, Gary Mauser's paper. I would have them read R. Blakes Brown's book, just because it's such a good historical primer, even if we don't always see eye to eye on policy issues. It's always sort of embarrassing, but I would probably have them read my book, just because it's...
Of course they should.
Well, yes, I think, not to toot my own horn, but I think it's addressing a gap, right? I'm not going to say it's a great book, but I think it addresses a gap, and it writes about a topic that there hasn't been very much written about in Canadian academia. So I think I would have them start with that, and then get out there and then actually talk to people and do some interview research, do some participant observation and things like that, because I think that's such an important part of this issue. We have a lot of people talking about gun policy who have never, either been through the process, the regulatory process, or handled a firearm. And to me, I think that's a shame, because if you're going to, it's like people who are, you think about in places historically which had the death penalty. You're willing to convict someone, but you're not willing to pull the lever that's going to hang them, right? I think you should, if you want to talk about regulation, you should put yourself through the regulation that people are having to go through.
And is there a question that you'd wish someone would tackle that you haven't gotten to yet?
Ooh, I don't think so, just because there's, I'm saving space for myself. There's a lot of projects that I want to do.
Gotcha.
One thing I'm working on now is policy on suppressors, because I think that's one of those aha moments that I had during my research, because once again, I grew up watching Hollywood movies. I'm a huge James Bond fan, and what do you see in James Bond? Someone has a suppressor and then a gun goes pew, pew, pew. Or what's happening in John Wick 2, right? He's having a firefight in a New York subway station with 2 suppressed handguns, and everyone's walking around like nothing's happening. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a lot of misconceptions about suppressors, silencers, right, that the public has. And if you look at countries like New Zealand, where they're completely legal and easy to have access to, countries like Finland, Norway, Sweden, where you're able to have easy access to them, they are good for people's hearing, and they reduce the negative externalities that come from hunting and target shooting, and there's no negative public safety implications with them. So that's something that I want to start pushing on as well, because I think it's something that we're not talking about.
I do think that there is legitimate public safety and OHS, occupational health and safety concerns that suppressors can solve.
100%. You would, people often make the illusion between guns and cars, right? Mm. You have a license to drive a car. Why don't you need a license to buy a gun? It's like an American talking point. Mm-hmm. Okay, if we're going to regulate guns like cars, if you drive around without a muffler, you're going to have a bad time.
That's it.
Right?
That's it. So your keynote speech for the NFA, you ended your keynote with, the image of the Canadian cowboy need not be gunless. Rather, we can tell another story. If a young Canadian hunter, sport shooter, or collector is listening right now and feels like the ground is shifting under them, what story do you want them to carry forward?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I think I would encourage them to, first of all, look to our history. Canada has a rich history that people tend not to explore. Once again, we live next to the U.S. The U.S. is way better at telling their own story than we are. There's, way more. I was searching recently for a biography of John A. Macdonald on my e-reader. Couldn't find one, or an audiobook, right? Because I wanted something I could just put on in the car when I'm stuck in traffic. I couldn't find an audiobook that told the story of our first prime minister's life, right? Huh. So I think look to Canada's history. Do the research, look into it. Find those stories, carry them forward, and then think about the way that we want to tell Canada's story going forward, and how you can do that in a way that asserts your place in it as a, responsible, law-abiding firearms owner who wants to contribute positively to our community, who's probably already contributing positive to the community. If you're involved in a shooting sport league, right? If you're a member at a range and you're a positive influence at your range, right? You are part of a community, and you are forming a community, and that's something that's very rare these days. We're so divided by technology, and most people aren't a member of a club. So I think you should tell that story that you are a highly regulated person who's contributing to the social fabric of Canada, who's continuing that legacy of responsible firearms ownership, of hunting, of just enjoying the wilderness that is so a part of Canada's story, and that you want to be someone who can contribute positively to the defense of our nation, and you should be allowed a space to do that.
Is there anything that we haven't talked about that we should be talking about?
No, this is comprehensive. I'm looking at the time. We've been talking for 2 hours.
We have been.
I never get to talk this long.
Noah, I really enjoyed this. Thank you so much for making the trek out from Abbotsford, for showing up in the studio like this, and for sharing all of your knowledge and everything that you've been working on. I appreciate it. Thank you.
It's such a pleasure. Thank you.